Hello, and welcome to the continuation of this podcast series, Medical Device Regulatory Affairs and the Future of the 510K. My name is Dr. Michael Drews. I would like to begin this installment by talking a bit about medical device regulatory affairs, but I want to make an important disclaimer that this is just a primer. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to this than what meets the eye, and we'll get to that in other installments in this series. So let's talk a bit about how do we get a medical device onto the market in the United States. Now let me also make an important disclaimer is that what I'm going to be discussing here is limited to what we do here in the United States. Obviously there are differences in other jurisdictions and other parts of the world, and those are not going to be discussed here. If you have questions about topics outside the US, feel free to contact me. Before beginning a discussion of bringing a medical device onto the market, we of course have to understand what exactly is a medical device. And since I've already discussed that in another podcast series, I'm not going to review that here. But once again, that question is not nearly as simple as so many people would like to think. And if you have questions about what a medical device is and would like some additional information, feel free to contact me. Also, let me begin by giving you just some general information. If you have not done so already, I would encourage you to visit the FDA's homepage, as you see here, and more specifically in the world of medical devices, you can visit the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, homepage. There's a number of great sources of information on that website, which I'll be referring to in some of the additional installments of this podcast. So bringing a medical device onto the market in the United States, in essence, is a three-step process. But once again, this is a high-level presentation, and the devil is in the details. There's a heck of a lot more to this than what a lot of people think. As a matter of fact, a great illustration of what I mean is the first question that most regulatory folks ask when looking at a new medical device is, what is the regulatory pathway? In other words, is it a PMA, a 510K, a de novo, an HDE, a CDE, something else? And by the way, if you're not familiar with all of those acronyms, now that's okay. I discuss them in other installments of this podcast. That is not the first question that should be asked. As a matter of fact, anybody that asks that as the first question, in my opinion, is making a huge mistake. Why? Because the first question that one should ask is not what is the regulatory pathway, but rather, is this device, is this product a regulated medical device? Why is this such an important question to ask at the very beginning? Simple, because if it is not a regulated medical device, then the pathway question never gets asked. To illustrate what I mean by this, let me share with you a quick example from my What is a Medical Device podcast. In this particular case, we're going to talk about a heated back wrap. Is a heated back wrap a medical device? Or perhaps better, a regulated medical device? Now, to most people, they would say, of course not. This is not a medical device. Why even ask this question? Well, let me share with you an excerpt from the company in Canada, Warm Buddy, that brought this to market recently. Researchers at the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey have concluded that heated wrap therapy is more effective for relieving lower back pain than drugs such as ibuprofen and acetaminophen. Now that is a very strong claim to make. In other words, that this medical device is more effective for back pain than drugs. Granted, these are over-the-counter or OTC drugs, but more effective than drugs. That's a very strong claim to make if this is an OTC product. This actually had to be substantiated, and in order to make this kind of a claim, they actually did a clinical trial. In a 6-month study involving 371 patients, participants were given the maximum recommended non-prescription or OTC dosage of either ibuprofen or acetaminophen, or the heated back wrap therapy for 2 days to treat acute lower back pain. A clinical trial of 370 patients followed over this period of time for a simple medical device like this. That would be unheard of. The question is, why would we do this? Why would the manufacturer want to do this? Well, let me share with you an excerpt from the announcement from this company. After more than a year of dealing with regulatory hoops, the Warm Buddy company has announced that its product has now been classified by Health Canada, what I affectionately refer to as the Canadian FDA, although they hate it when I refer to them that way, but it has been classified by Health Canada as an official medical device. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I work as a consultant for Health Canada as well as FDA, but I was not involved in this particular product. So why would they bother? Most companies would prefer to not deal with any regulatory agency, be it Health Canada or FDA or anybody else, if they can get away with it. So why bother going out of their way to actually get this product regulated as a medical device? Well, simple. Because they wanted to make this claim that their product was better than the drugs. As a result, they said that we're thrilled as a result of our new medical device designation. We are not only back in business, but now we have the ability to make medical claims for our products. Once again, they could not make such a strong claim. In other words, their product is better than the OTC drugs without getting it classified as a medical device and without doing the clinical trials to support that. So this question of what is a medical device, as I discuss in more detail in another podcast series, is definitely not as simple as so many people think. Definitely not. Although it's surprising to me how many people, especially how many people in regulatory affairs, think that the question, what is a medical device, is a simple, perhaps even a trivial question. It's definitely not nearly so simple. So why did Health Canada think this way, or what does FDA think about this particular product? I'll leave those as rhetorical questions for now. What is most important is what you think. To wrap up this particular example, let me just illustrate by saying that if you ask the first question, what is the regulatory pathway of your device, you are automatically assuming that the medical device is a regulated medical device. But if you can make the case that it's not a regulated medical device, you have a huge benefit. You don't have to deal with any regulatory agencies. Now, as a general rule, and this is one of my most basic medical device rules, if you can argue that it's not a regulated medical device, then by all means do so. However, there are exceptions to every rule, and this particular case that we just looked at is one of them. In other words, we want to make a strong medical claim. Therefore, we need to have it classified as a regulated medical device and be able to do the clinical trial to support that claim. There may be other issues involved too. For example, reimbursement. If it's not a regulated medical device, chances are the product is going to be sold over the counter, and as a result, patients are going to have to pay out of pocket. Well, that might not be desirable in certain situations. Because of reimbursement, you might want to get the product on the market as a regulated medical device, so either the insurance company or Medicare or whoever it is will pay much, if not all, of the cost of the product, and therefore it'll make it easier for your patients, your customers, to use your product. Again, there are other examples of why we might want to make it a regulated device as well, but medical claims and reimbursement is just two examples of that. Okay, assuming that the medical device you're bringing onto the market is a regulated medical device, the next question to ask is, what is the classification? In the world of medical devices, we break the world into three layers, three strata, as I call them. Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. And in a general sense, and this is a very important point, in a general sense, in a theoretical sense, the classification is based on the level of risk. Now, the word risk has many different connotations. Primarily with risk, we're talking about here the risk of the product causing harm to the patient. So as a general rule, the lower the class, the lower the risk. or the higher the class, the higher the risk. But there are many exceptions to that rule, and we'll talk about some of those in the following installments of this podcast. But one thing I want to point out here is that this classification system is very unique to medical devices. In other words, we do not have a similar classification system for drugs or biologics. We could have such a system, and that would be the topic of another discussion and debate, but we do not. We have this classification system only in the world of medical devices. The question is why? Well, the answer is very simple. This is a great illustration of how it's not enough, it's not sufficient to understand just what the regulation says. We also have to understand why the regulation exists. In other words, what is the philosophy? Well, in the world of medical devices, we have a very broad spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have things like wheelchairs and Band-Aids and EKG monitors. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, we have things like totally implantable artificial hearts. Now, it should not take an MD or a PhD or an RAC after someone's name to appreciate that, gee, maybe it doesn't make sense to subject a Band-Aid to the same level of scrutiny, to the same level of testing, either in vitro or in vivo, as another medical device like a totally implantable artificial heart. And as a result, this is why we have this classification system here in the United States, so that we can group medical devices that are more similar in risk, or at least the theory goes. Once again, that, and this is an important point, that is the theory. When we look at the reality, it's not nearly so simple. Now, the last thing I'll mention briefly about classification is that this particular podcast series is focusing on the United States. In other jurisdictions in other parts of the world, we also oftentimes use classification system like this, but whether or not it's risk-based, that depends on where in the world you're talking about. And more importantly, oftentimes other jurisdictions, they use the same terminology, the same class, but different numbering systems. So I'm not going to get into that here, but suffice it to say, class 2 here in the United States might not be the same as what class 2 means in some other part of the world. In my opinion, that just makes the world more confusing than it needs to be, but that's the topic of a different conversation. Okay, the third step in this three-step process of bringing a medical device onto the market in the United States, once we have answered whether or not it's a regulated medical device and determined the classification, now we can select the appropriate marketing application. In other words, the regulatory pathway that we need to take. Now, an important point to note in all of regulatory affairs, including in the medical device world, is that there rarely ever is only one correct answer. They're unlike in arithmetic where 2 plus 2 equals 4 and there's no other possibility. In the real world of regulatory affairs, there's a lot of different possibilities, and we have to understand what all of the different possible pathways are in order to be able to choose the appropriate one in our particular situation. So let's talk very briefly about our choices in pathways bringing medical devices onto the market. Once again, we're limiting our discussion here in the United States. There are two primary choices, and what I mean by that, there are the two most commonly used regulatory pathways to bring medical devices onto the market is first and foremost the pre-market notification, or PMN, oftentimes referred to as the 510K. And this is based on the very nebulous concept, very difficult to define and understand concept of substantial equivalence. I'll talk about that in a subsequent installment of this podcast. Now, I oftentimes say it's unfortunate that people refer to this as the 510K, even though that it's very commonly done. Incidentally, 510K simply corresponds to the name or the address from the Code of Federal Regulations where this particular regulation is described. The reason why I think it's a mistake to refer to this as a 510K, even though virtually everybody does, is it because it does not emphasize that this is a pre-market notification. It is not an approval, and that's an important point I'll talk about in a subsequent podcast. okay? I think it's better to refer to this as a PMN, or pre-market notification, as opposed to a 510K, because it enforces in our minds that this is a notification, this is not an approval, and that's an important point. For those that know something about medicine, the medical equivalent is in diabetes, for example. We have many types of diabetes. The two most commonly known are so-called type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In my opinion, we should not refer to them as type 1 and type 2. We should refer to them by their proper names as insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, IDDM, so-called type 1 diabetes, and non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, NIDDM, so-called type 2 diabetes, because once again it emphasizes what we're really talking about here. So that's the most common pathway that medical devices use to bring onto the market. The next most common pathway is the investigational device exemption, or IDE, which is followed by the pre-market approval, or PMA. So the IDE followed by the PMA, for those that are familiar with the role of drugs and biologics, is kind of like the IND NDA for drugs, or the IND BLA pathway for biologics. And again, notice I'm saying kind of like, because it is a bit of a stretch to compare the IDE PMA pathway on the medical device side of the world to the IND NDA pathway for drugs, or the IND BLA pathway for biologics. It's kind of a stretch. 510K, as we're going to talk about in another installment, or the pre-market notification, that is totally unique to the medical device world. There is nothing similar to it in the world of drugs and biologics. Now, some might argue that on the drug side of the world, the closest thing that we have is the abbreviated NDA, the ANDA, that we often use to bring, for example, generic drugs onto the market. Granted, that is closer to the pre-market notification than the true NDA, but it still is a bit of a stretch. So the two primary choices for bringing medical devices onto the market in the U.S. are the pre-market notification, or PMN, or the IDE PMA pathway. But those are not the only two choices. There are additional pathways that we can use to bring medical devices onto the market. I'm not going to talk about them in detail here, although I will just mention them briefly. The first is the de novo pathway. This is sort of to help bridge the gap between the PMA and 510K world. Again, I'm not going to get into that here, but in an additional installment, I'll talk more about the de novo pathway. It is not very commonly used, although I think a lot of people, because they don't understand it, because it's not commonly used, because there is not a lot of precedent, they are missing huge opportunities, because I think the de novo pathway does represent or does provide a lot of advantages that many people do not take advantage of, but that's the topic of a different installment. Another pathway that's available is the humanitarian use device, or HUD, followed by the humanitarian device exemption, or HDE. For those that are familiar with the drug side of the world, this is sort of akin to the orphan drug program for medical devices. There are some similarities, but there are also some important differences as well, and I'm not going to get into those here. That's the subject of a different podcast. We also have the custom device exemption, or CDE. This is a very seldomly used pathway, but in the right circumstances, it can be advantageous. As a matter of fact, because it is so seldomly used, there is very little regulation, very little guidance around this. This is similar to the de novo pathway. There's also very little regulation or guidance. And let me just talk about that for a moment. A lot of people view the lack of regulation or guidance as a disadvantage. Me, being the contrarian that I am, I love to work in areas where there is not a lot of regulation, or the regulation is very general or nebulous, or indeed there's no regulation at all. Why? Because simply put, that gives me more of an opportunity to do what I want to do, or what I think I need to do. So most people look at the absence of regulation as a disadvantage. On the contrary, I look at it as a huge advantage. And the last pathway that I'll mention very briefly is the emergency use or compassionate use situations. Once again, these are not commonly used, but you need to know at least that they exist and a little bit about them. Bottom line is quite simply this. Although these pathways that you see here are not used very much compared to the pre-market notification and the PMA, what it comes down to is this: unless you understand all of the different possible pathways that are available to you and the advantages and disadvantages of each one, how can you know when to use, or alternatively when to not use, each one of them? And if you don't know that, then quite frankly, as a regulatory professional, how can you do your job? When I consult for medical device companies, my job is quite simply this, twofold. The first step is to identify all of the different possible pathways to get their product onto the market. Not just the most commonly used pathway, but all of the different pathways. To present the advantages and disadvantages to each one. I will, of course, offer my recommendation. In other words, I might say, well, here's option 1, here's option 2, here's option 3. Here are the advantages and disadvantages of each. And based on my experience and my analysis, I think in your particular case, option 2 is the most appropriate, and here's why. And then the manufacturer will say, okay, we agree with you, let's go down that pathway. Or, okay, we disagree with you, perhaps for some other reason, because of reimbursement, we're going to go down pathway 3. Fine. When they make that decision, now my job becomes, shifts to the implementation side. In other words, okay, so we've chosen to go down a particular path. Now, let's identify the sequence of steps. In medicine and pathophysiology, we call this a mechanism. First we do this, step 1, then step 2, step 3, and so on, in order to get us from where we are to where we want to be. But it does not end there. For most people, it ends there by just identifying that pathway, that mechanism. It doesn't end there, because at each of those steps, I ask the question, well, what problems, what questions can we get? One of my most basic philosophies when it comes to dealing with the FDA or any regulatory agency is once, although it's impossible to anticipate every question, every possible problem, we can anticipate many. And so before presenting a product at the FDA, I will ask myself, and I will sometimes ask some of my colleagues, what questions, what concerns might you have at each step along this path? And then I will come up with answers to each one of those, or as many as I can. And then the next step after that is to prioritize them. So I might come up with a laundry list of, say, 50 or 100 questions or more. And then I will prioritize them. So oftentimes it's not possible to say, well, here's the most likely and the next likely and so on. But I want to prioritize them into 3 or 4 layers, 3 or 4 strata, if you will, so that these questions on top are the most likely questions to be asked. These questions on the bottom are the least likely questions to be asked. And then these questions in the middle have some possibility of being asked. All right. So then I try to come up with answers, and then the next step in this process is to identify which of these questions that I want to answer prophylactically. That is, before the question even has a chance to be asked. Because one of the lessons I've learned from politicians is there's no better way to control the spin than to answer a question before it's asked. So how do I know which question I want to ask before it's asked? In other words, prophylactically? Simple. If that question and answer takes me in a direction that I otherwise would want to go, I will, by all means, if I have time, I will answer the question. But if that question or answer takes me in a direction that I'm not sure, or perhaps I don't want to go, I won't answer that question as part of my presentation prophylactically, but I will definitely be prepared to address it should it be asked. So, for example, prior to going to FDA to do a presentation of a product, I might have in my slide deck 15 or 20 or 25 slides that I might be planning on showing. But I might walk in there with 3, 4, or 500 slides, so that if somebody asks me one of these questions, I will be much likely more prepared to respond to it. Once again, one of my most basic philosophies, while you cannot anticipate every question, you can't anticipate every problem, you can anticipate many. And this is what goes into a regulatory strategy. Lots of people can fill out simple forms and write submissions, But when it comes to regulatory strategy, and especially competitive regulatory strategy, for example, designing a regulatory strategy not simply to get your product onto the market, but at the same time to make it more difficult, to act as a barrier to entry, to make it more difficult for your competition to get their product onto the market. That is the true art of regulatory science. That is well beyond the scope of this particular podcast, but it's a very powerful application of regulatory strategy. And if you're interested in more information or have questions on how to do that, please contact me. That concludes this particular installment of Medical Device Regulatory Affairs and the Future of the 510K. My name is Dr. Michael Drews. Should you have any questions or if there's anything I can do to help you, please feel free to contact me. Thank you for your attention.